Welcome back to Knockout Arcade, an upcoming retro pixel art fighting game. It's been a while since I've updated you all on anything related to development. Sorry for the wait, I've just been super busy with schoolwork as usual, but I'm back today with another devlog. For this past sprint, I've decided to work on the single player aspect of Knockout Arcade. My plan for the game has always been to have a campaign mode with different levels and minigames, so by getting a small level built out, I could see what kinds of level designs would be possible in a game like this. I figured there was no better way to start a campaign than with a short tutorial level to teach the player the very basics of the game. Doing this allowed me to experience the entire pipeline of creating a level, from concept to implementation to playtesting to refinement. Of course, I also made some very small changes to the engine while I was at it, but I was pretty busy throughout these last few months, so I hope you'll understand that there isn't as much content this time around. Now with all that out of the way, let's get into how I made a tutorial for my 2D fighting game. Here's a brief overview of the level to get you guys up to speed. We start off with a truck that pulls in and delivers the player into the level. The level then introduces a large open space to the right side of the player with a few coins floating around. This is a level design technique that I pulled straight from the original Super Mario Bros. And in fact, I use a lot of similar level design philosophies to older video games. We have the small area that teaches the player to move and attack things before moving into a segment with slopes and semi-solid platforms. This whole construction area is meant to introduce new terrain types to the player so that they can get used to them before being moved on to other challenges. Following a short reminder on attacks, we have the player's first enemy encounter with this construction manager who's not so happy at us for making a mess. This fight is fairly easy, as it's meant to get the player used to attacking enemies and dodging attacks. The level ends fairly quickly afterwards, showing the results screen before transitioning back to the main map. That was a very quick synopsis of this level, but I'd like to go into a bit more depth on my thoughts behind why I made each of the decisions I did, and show you guys what it was like to make a level from start to finish. The first step was to establish what the players should learn and how they should learn it. My goal is to teach the players the very basics on how to play the game, which in my mind surmounts to how to move, jump, and attack things. These are the three basic mechanics that the player should know how to do. There are of course multiple mechanics in a fighting game that the player can learn, such as combos or blocking, but those concepts are very difficult to teach in an organic way without using text, and I really wanted to stick to old school design principles to help give my game a more retro feel, and a lot of that comes down to making the player learn by constructing challenges for them to overcome. For example, we have this very basic dumpster with some coins on top of it. This challenge requires the player to either learn to jump on top of it or destroy the dumpster by attacking it. The player cannot proceed until either one of those options are figured out, meaning that from here on, the player is guaranteed to know how to perform one of those actions, and I can create challenges using them later on. You can't collect these coins if you attack the dumpster, so even players who don't learn to jump before destroying it have a reason to stick around. Similarly, there's this large dumpster with a huge pile of garbage on it. The player cannot easily jump over this obstacle, meaning they must figure out how to attack in order to progress. This challenge also gives the players some time to figure out what different buttons do. It gives them an opportunity to learn how to string attacks together in a way that doesn't force anything on them. They are free to experiment until the dumpster is destroyed, and then they can move on with the level. This next area is meant to teach the player how to interact with slopes and semi-solids. Slopes behave pretty much how you'd expect them to. Semi-solids are platforms that you can pass through from the bottom, but not from the top. These are very common in platformer games, and allow for a lot of interesting design possibilities. The coins act as guidance to the player, telling them where they can and can't go, and also act as a reward for completing challenges. This next area has an optional challenge designed to introduce the idea that objects can interact with each other in a level. We have this green box with a $sign, suggesting that there is some prize inside that the player can collect. The player cannot actually hit this object, but they should notice that there's a precariously hanging girder directly above them. If the player decides to jump from the wooden platform to the girder and hit the rope, the girder will fall down and crash onto the box, opening it and spilling out all of its goodies. Most players will probably walk right past it, but for the players who decide to investigate it, it acts as a great introductory challenge to jumping on platforms. Moving on, we have this short area with a dirt mound and a car. Both are meant to get the player more comfortable with navigating on slopes and platforms. The trash can suggests that the player should try hitting it and seeing how it interacts with the different platform heights. Finally, there's one more giant dumpster to remind the player how to attack before moving on to the first enemy encounter. The player cannot leave this area until the enemy is defeated, so this challenge is meant to get the player used to fighting enemies and dodging attacks. The enemy's AI is pretty simple, it just moves towards the player and attacks them. But it's designed in a way to engage with the player and make them have to worry about getting hit and dodging. It also gives them an opportunity to test out their attacks on an actual opponent instead of on an object. Once the fight is over, the camera is freed up and the player is free to move to the right once more. The level ends pretty quickly after that because by now, the player should have learned everything they need to know in order to be able to tackle the rest of the game's challenges. Alright, I know that was a lot of talking, but I really like delving into the design of levels and what makes them tick. It's important to think through absolutely everything in a level to ensure that everything has a reason to exist and that the player is not confused as to what something's purpose is for. With all of that out of the way, I'd like to go over what it was like to create this level from scratch. I started off with my list of goals for what the level needed to accomplish. Then I set out on making a very quick list of every mechanic that I would have to implement and program in order for the level to be fully functional. Then I created a very basic paper map of the entire level, complete with explanations for each area and what the player is expected to learn. Once I had an idea of what to make, I began the process for implementing all of the key mechanics I needed for the level. The first things I programmed were the slopes and semi-solid platforms. I had to do a lot of bug testing in order to make sure that these objects worked, and there might still be a few things to iron out, but for the most part, they worked just fine. I used a bunch of placeholder assets so that I could test the level's functionality without needing to create full sprites. This allowed me to make important changes before finalizing the level. The next thing I added were the different destructible objects that the player could interact with. There's a surprising amount of different properties that the objects needed to have. For example, an object needs to be able to define what kind of surface it should create, or whether or not it should even have a surface at all. To accomplish this, I actually used GameMaker's built-in variable definitions, which I had never used before. These allow you to define variables for an object and allow you to set new values for those variables in the children of the object without having to recreate the create event each time. That was a bit of a simplified explanation, but this was still a super useful feature, and I'll definitely be using it a lot more going forward. The next two features were cutscenes and fight triggers. I wanted to be able to use cutscenes in the levels and have special encounters that require the player to defeat an enemy to move forward. I won't go into too much detail on how I programmed the cutscenes, but I pretty much just followed Cosmic Astronaut's tutorial on making a cutscene system, and it works pretty well in my case. For fight triggers, I'm able to define where the camera should be locked, what enemy to spawn in, and where to spawn the walls so the player doesn't escape the area. This is also done using the variable definitions I talked about earlier. Next up on the list was changing up the HUD and the UI. Since there's only one player, I only need to show one health bar. I would actually like there to be some couch co-op in this game, but that'll definitely be a stretch goal for later. Some other elements I wanted to include were a timer to keep track of how long the player has been in the level for, and a money counter to keep track of the player's cash. Of course, you can't have a money counter without money, so I decided to make the collectibles in the level into quarters. They fit the arcade theme of the game very nicely, and they serve as a way to both guide and reward the player for overcoming obstacles. I figured it'd be cool if there was a screen that showed up once the player completed a level, so I created some assets to be used for a completion screen. It tracks various statistics such as how many things the player has destroyed, how long it took them to beat the level, how much damage they took, and how much money they earned. I also put a letter grade in, but I never actually made a grading system. I also didn't get around to making a proper animation for Russell, so he just uses his intro animation as a placeholder. My last programming task was to create the AI for the opponent. I had never actually done any sort of AI programming before that point, but luckily one of my college classes was actually covering AI programming techniques at the time, so I used a lot of those concepts when creating the AI system. The AI works by having a controller object and an AI behavior object. The controller holds data about different inputs that need to be sent to the pawn object, and the AI behavior object does all of the logic and decision making for the character. The AI itself is actually pretty simple. It walks to a set distance from the player and then attacks them. It will keep doing this until it dies. I designed it in this way to make the player feel like they were actually fighting someone, but still give them an easy opponent for them to beat up. The player is never in any real danger. Plus, the attack I gave the NPC has a really slow windup, so players can easily just walk out of the way or jump over the NPC to avoid the attack. Finally, once all of the features were in place, I went on to create the background assets for the stage. I included a bunch of things from buildings to construction equipment. I definitely rushed towards the end, as I was starting to get really busy around this time, so that's why the arcade looks kinda crappy. I was able to add some finishing touches as well, like the clouds moving, the truck cutscene, and some construction workers in the background. I actually found an interesting GameMaker bug while making these NPCs. Their animation speed variable will only ever be 1 frame per second, even if you set it to be something else. As it turns out, this is actually a known bug to happen on my specific version of GameMaker, which is actually quite old at this point. I did manage to find a workaround, so I was able to keep development moving along. With all these assets done and the functionality complete, I got some people together to do some playtesting on the level. Playtesting the level was pretty interesting, and I managed to catch a lot of things and discover how players behaved in the level. My group of playtesters were all people who had never played fighting games before, which is exactly the kind of group I am looking to target. To start with a positive, every single person who played the level finished it, so at least I know it wasn't too hard. But on the other hand, there were some hiccups in my original design. Some players struggled to figure out how to jump, as most games have a dedicated button for jumping, whereas Knockout Arcade uses up on the control stick to jump. Another point of contention was the entire construction area. Players would simply walk right past everything and not interact with many of the platforms. This semi-solo at the beginning was too high to jump onto from the ground, so many players just gave up and continued walking to the right. When players got to this green box, they would attempt to hit the box, fail, and then not notice the large girder above it. On the bright side, every player figured out how to attack and thus were able to defeat the enemy at the end of the stage. It looked to me like the players weren't being challenged enough by the AI, since it would often just walk around and wait to be hit. So I changed the AI to be far more aggressive than it used to be, so as to feel like the player is actually fighting someone and actually has an opponent to defeat. After getting feedback, I set out to make some changes to the level. I made this first platform a bit lower to the ground so that the player can actually jump to it, and I added some signs at the beginning of the level that quickly display where the player needs to go and what buttons they can press. I also introduced grabs with this sign, since I figured it wouldn't hurt to let the player know that this option exists. And that was my experience creating the level. While I did learn some valuable things, I would also like to get more people to test it. I haven't found any new playtesters since that group, and it has been a while since I worked on the level. Nonetheless, I think the level I created works fairly well to introduce the player to the main mechanics of the game. I'm decided to work more on levels in the future, and there will definitely be more enemies to defeat and harder platforming challenges. I even plan on making some levels revolve around a character's special moves, such as Beverly's Fireball or Jay's Spirit. It might be a while before I work on another level, as I have some other plans for the near future, but this should give you an idea as to what levels for this game might look like. Now I'd like to go over some of the other additions that I've made since the last update. The first extra thing I added was to completely change the menu input system. Before, all of the menus in this game would use the same controls as the player's combat controls, which I feared would end up confusing players since most people are used to the menus being a certain way. I don't want the player to have to get used to navigating menus with different control schemes. This also fixed an issue I had where the menu buttons to confirm and deny were the X and Y buttons rather than the A and B buttons. The menus should now be easier and more standardized with other games. Related to this change was adding D-pad support for controllers. A lot of players like navigating menus with the D-pad, and since I was overhauling the controls anyways, I figured I might as well add support for it. The game also saves any controls that you've set between play sessions as well. That way you don't need to re-enter your controls anytime you replay the game. In terms of bug fixes, I mainly focused on fixing up some issues with projectiles. I kept running into random crashes with them, but hopefully most of those should be resolved. Let me know in the comments or in the itch page if you guys ever run into a crash with the game. And lastly, I decided to work on Beverly's animations. I only had time to get her jumping light attack done, but it was a good way to get warmed up for making sprites for her. Someone else actually did most of Beverly's animations, but since I didn't pitch to production studio again, they left the team. Their name is still in the credits along with everyone else who has ever worked on the game. And that's pretty much everything I got around to doing these past few months. It's not much, but hopefully you guys will understand since I'm back to being a solo dev for now. That said, I do have one more announcement that I'd like to make. I'm proud to announce that me and a bunch of my friends will be attending the Game Developers Conference in 2024. This is a huge and exciting opportunity for me, as I get to meet so many cool industry professionals and hopefully make a bunch of impressions and connections. I also plan on bringing a demo of Knockout Arcade to the event so I can get more feedback and people to test the game. In preparation for GDC, I plan on adding a whole lot of polish to the game, including new transition screens, options, menus, animations, attacks, and more. I really want this game to feel legit, like something someone would see and think, I'd spend money on this if it were complete. I'm going to focus on making Beverly and Russell as functional as they can possibly be. That way, players can get a glimpse as to how the game would feel like to play. I'm currently on winter break, so I plan to start working on the game again once the semester starts up. I leave for GDC on March 16th, so that gives me about 10 weeks to focus up and polish the game. I'm planning out exactly what I want to include and when I plan to work on it, and as a special treat, I'll be recording the development process for each week. I might upload them all separately as I go, or I might wait until the end to release them all at once. In any case, look forward to a lot more Knockout Arcade content from me in the future. That's it for this.
Aren't you forgetting something?
Oh, right. I almost forgot. I'd like you all to meet the final boss of Knockout Arcade, Bruce Krauser. He's a vicious CEO and the current owner of the arcade. He has some dastardly plans for Knockout Arcade, and it'll be up to each of the game's fighters to take down this corrupt capitalist once and for all. I obviously took a lot of inspiration from classic fighting game villains in creating his design, most notably Geese Howard and Rugal from Fatal Fury and the King of Fighters. I also made his hair a reference to the 90s Mario movie version of King Koopa, which fits pretty well since Koopa was also this sort of big evil president guy. And just for fun, I also made a bunch of alternate palettes for him. I snuck in a couple references in there, so see if you can figure out what they are. Okay, now that's everything for real this time. As stated earlier, my plans going forward revolve around getting the game ready for GDC, and I'll be providing updates on my progress as I go. I'm still working on the game alone at the moment, and I still have classes I have to do, but I still intend to make the game as great as it can possibly be. Thank you for watching, and there's a new version of the game with all of the aforementioned features on itch.io, link in the description. I cannot thank you enough for all the ongoing support for this project. We've almost reached 1,000 views on itch, and my channel is at almost 500 subscribers. Let's keep the momentum going, and I'll see you all next time with another Knockout Arcade devlog.